At Communitech, we're working hard to bring you business as virtual as much as possible while also supporting our members the best we can. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything session. My name is Christina Wood, Director of Start and Scale Programs at Communitech, and I'm very excited to have Matt Weller and Peter Heuss from Berlin Kraftworks here today to answer all of your questions about how to bring a physical product to market. Before I turn it over to Peter and Matt to further introduce themselves, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded so that we can share it at a later date with companies to view or refer back to. All of our previous Ask Me Anything recordings can be found at communitech.ca. Second, I ask that you keep your microphone on mute during the session. Please use the chat functionality to ask any questions that you have. We do welcome questions throughout the discussion, so don't feel like you need to hold those until the end. We really do want this to be an interactive session. If you'd like to connect with either Matt or Peter after today's session, please reach out to them directly on LinkedIn or at Berlin Kraftworks. And lastly, please check out Your Week in Tech or our Startup and Scale Up newsletters for a list of all of our upcoming Ask Me Anything sessions. You'll see two on the slides here that are planned for the beginning of November. So with that, thank you both Peter and Matt for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you to further introduce yourselves.
Sure. Well, I'll go first. I'm Matt Weller. I'm co-founder of Berlin Kraftworks. I've got 20 years working in manufacturing, a lot of different industries, a lot of different types of products in those industries, including tech. And, I think in context of this conversation, I've spent 20 years figuring out how to bring products from a prototype phase into the marketplace. And I do that from a supply chain point of view because that's my background. This leads to the topic of how do you do that? And it's a topic that we never really talk about very much. We hear lots about other areas of business, but we never hear much about it. So I'm happy to be here today to talk from that context. And, obviously Berlin Kraftworks is focused on helping people to do just that. But we'll, if people are interested, they can find out more later. I should say also that I am not just a supply chain guy, but I'm actually trained in supply chain. So I went to school to do this, which is a funny thing. A lot of people look at me like, really? You went to school to do supply chain? Yes, I did. And I'm proud of it, but call me crazy. And I'll turn it over to Peter, who can speak more from his side.
Yeah, so I'm Peter Heuss, and I'm the engineering side of things. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've been at it a few years longer than Matt has, by the white and lack of hair. But I've had a really wide career in a number of industries, and it includes a considerable amount of manufacturing, both from the design and the manufacturing point of view. I've worked in engineering design and system installation, system design, and I've been involved in a good number of startups. So actually taking a product from an initial concept and building up the teams and the systems and getting the product into manufacturing. And this is Berlin Kraftworks, when we started it, I think is my 6th startup. So once you start doing startups, you never go back. But after one of my big startups, after I left that, I came down to help some friends that were in the Velocity program. And I met Mike Kirkup, who was running Velocity at the time, and we struck up a conversation and decided that Velocity really needed a hardware section because the hardware companies required a lot more support than software did in terms of mentorship and resources and various direction. So I went and I joined Velocity for 5 years and tried to figure out what I could help with startups, and very much enjoyed it. But one of the big things I left Velocity with was understanding that there is almost no support out there for a company that wants to figure out what to do to take their product into production. There doesn't seem to be any one source. The schools don't teach it well. That's my humble opinion. I'll argue that all day long. But there aren't also many companies that will consider production from start to finish. So I met Matt, who was also looking for a change and wanted to help companies. And we both think about developing products in the same fashion. You have to consider not just engineering, not just supply chain, not just manufacturing. They all have to be considered at the same time. The whole process is not linear. You have to understand how everything interacts and plan accordingly. And we started Berlin Kraftworks to actually help give that support to companies and do it in a way that is maybe not as traditionally common. So I'm the mechanical engineer side. I've done design, I've done project management, hands-on. I still do some design, so I still get into the thick of the production. So happy to help on any part of the process from start to finish, concept to customer.
Great. Thank you both, Matt and Peter. That's a great intro to today's conversation. So as you mentioned, manufacturing is a complex process and it's not linear. So I think maybe we should start there today and just explore what should companies be thinking about early on with respect to all of the complexities.
Matt?
Yeah, sure. Well, being the supply chain guy, I'll always say you should be thinking about supply chain early on for starters. Someone once asked me, well, when do I actually need to start thinking about supply chain? And I usually tell them sometime after you had your initial idea and sometime before you drew it out on the napkin. These things interact with each other. Before you can know what you can design and how you might design it and how you might produce it, you might need to understand what resources are available for you to be able to produce it, and could it be done cost effectively? And a lot of these things are supply chain questions. But moreover, as you said, it's not a linear process. And I think that's a really important point to highlight. A lot of people, particularly if it's a firm that's developing a physical product for the first time, they'll take an approach of, here's several steps that I need to go through. I need some engineering work at some point. I need some supply chain work at some point. I need packaging at some point and logistics at some point. And even external to that, I need some marketing at some point and some sales at some point. And the reality of it is all those things have to work together almost from day one in order to have a really effective product because they will all bring to the table valid and important considerations in terms of bringing that product up that you will not only not get if you look at individual pieces in isolation, but very often it can become an issue where you'll end up having to redo portions of it again because, well, we've done this engineering work and it looks really great. Oh, wait a minute, it can't be manufactured. So now we have to go back and change that design and try to make it manufacturable, as an example. So it's definitely not linear. And I should say with that, it is complex, but it's not impossible. There is methods to work through it. That's the supply chain side of it. Perhaps Peter might want to give an engineer's perspective.
When we develop a prototype, we'll have a nice little idea. We'll cobble together something that works. We'll prove that the concept works, and we've done some engineering to do it. And might be designing a board and worrying about getting some communications working and taking some signals and spitting out some information. And you have to put that board into a container and some sort of housing and get it out for people to use. But that board, in designing the board, we often talk about we talk about DFM, DFT, we refer to it as DFX. It's designed for various things. When we do that initial prototype design, we often cobble together and just make sure that the idea works. And that's great. You've got a proof of concept and the idea is good. And now you can take that off to prove to that it's a sellable product, and investors will like it, and the salespeople will like it, and there's a way to market it, yada yada. But now when you take that idea and try and make it into an actual product, you have to consider when you go back to design it for manufacturing, you're going to design it to be manufactured. So in the board, for example, you have to worry about how many you're going to make, and that's going to change how the board is manufactured and what components are on it, and do those components exist now? Will they exist when you a year from now when you're producing it in volume? I've seen a lot of companies design a board to handle all their technological problems, and they've picked a wonderful new product, and the chip solves all of their issues, and then they go to manufacture it in some sort of volume, and they realize that the chip they designed it on, well, it was just an early release, and they've changed it, and now they can't get it in volume, or it's a 6-month lead time, and there's a requirement to buy 100,000 of them as a minimum order, and now they can't use that chip, and they have to go back and redesign. So design for manufacturing, design for supply chain, and another important one is design for test. And this one comes up in electronics manufacturing quite a lot too. When you're producing boards in great volumes, you're soldering all sorts of incredibly small components, and you're placing components that my old eyes can almost not see without a magnifying glass now. And you have to test these boards to make sure the soldering was right, that the components work. If you don't do that and put it into your assembly and then try and debug a problem afterwards, it can be a big problem. So you have to design your product to be tested along the manufacturing process to make sure that you're producing the same thing the same way every time, and then it works 100% when you put it in the box to ship it to the customer. What all this means is when you're designing, you have to consider the processes that get involved in making the product. I mentioned the electronics one. If that product goes into a plastic enclosure, you may machine the first few enclosures, and then you may mold the next enclosures, and that's a different design. So as the process grows, as the volumes grow, you have to actually have a design that considers all these things along the way. So that includes the considering the supply chain, considering the manufacturing, and then in terms of electronics, we have to worry about product certifications, which is really just a quality control step. And again, we're thinking of design for test, design for functionality, design for manufacturing. So you have to consider how you're going to test to make sure that all these products are made the same way, consistently and well throughout the manufacturing.
Mm-hmm. And then, supply chain feeds back into that again on the other end, because if you get down the road where you've got a proof of concept that you've figured out, you want to start looking at, well, can I ship it around? What are the logistics requirements? If it has batteries, what are the logistics requirements? Anyone that's tried to ship a lithium battery around or has a product that runs on it knows that there are very tight logistics requirements there that have to be considered. That might impact the form factor of the battery if you're producing your own battery, for example. You need to consider other things in terms of how you're going to be manufacturing it. Those decisions, those design decisions can actually, I don't think it's too dramatic to say they can impact the profitability of your firm. If you're designing something that is very difficult to produce or cannot be produced effectively or efficiently, or is adding features or qualities to it that your customer perhaps doesn't really care about, or at least wouldn't care about enough to pay a premium for it, then that's going to cut into the profitability of the product as well. So there's several downstream considerations. Now, all of that sounds pretty daunting. I think anyone that's been through it before might say, yeah, and anyone who hasn't been through it before might say, oh yeah. But I think with all that, I'd want to say I heard a catchphrase once. I won't say where I heard it. It was locally, but it was a comment that someone said, "Well, hardware is hard." And it was in reference to why are people creating more software firms than firms with a physical product? And they said, "Well, hardware is hard." And I think I challenged that idea. I don't think that it's hard necessarily, but it is a different mindset. And it's a different mindset for sure than a software approach. One of the biggest mindsets is that in a physical product, you're going to invest a lot of capital up front, and then amortize it over your sales, so you'll get that money back. Whereas in a software firm, I think it's easier to scale on a cash flow basis. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it may be easier. So in manufacturing, there's a huge requirement for you to be effective in those costs. Most startup firms don't have a lot of capital to spend, so what they're going to spend, they need to be effective with it. So, as well as saying it's not linear and all these things interchange or interconnect with each other, there's also a degree of risk management for the firm itself in setting that up properly. But it can be done. It can usually be done here, which is a whole other topic. A lot of people will, maybe I'll sort of segue into this. A lot of people will talk about offshoring. There's still a fairly popular notion that if you want to get anything produced, you need to go offshore, or at the very least, you can't do it here, as in Ontario or North America. And I mean, if COVID has shown us anything, it's really highlighted our manufacturing resources, because we had to in a hurry for PPE, among other things. But what we saw in that is kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's actually a ton of resources here, but maybe I'll go back to Peter to sort of talk about an engineering perspective to sourcing locally or abroad.
No, totally. There's absolutely marvelous manufacturing infrastructure, even in southwestern Ontario, from electronics to plastics to steel machining and sheet metal. Pretty much anything you want to do can be done in Ontario. And I've spent my time in China working with big electronics firms, multiple trips over there, and there is a place for large scale manufacturing offshore, but we're talking cell phone large. To go and do small runs, and I mean like under a million pieces, it's really much more beneficial to look at doing it locally. And it's where a lot of firms come into some very large problems, because they, especially when you're developing a product, if you're using resources that are on the other side of the planet, quite literally, there's a 12-hour time difference. It's up to 24 hours door to door to travel there. There's a language and cultural barrier, and so your information flow stagnates. It's delayed. It's confused. You can't easily go and deal with the people that are actually manufacturing your product. You can't deal with them on a face-to-face basis. There are a lot of hurdles to get over, and there's a lot of complications. And then when you do get your product, you have to ship it, which is back to Matt's world in how do you get large volumes of parts from overseas to back home again, and then where do they go from there, and thinking about the logistics and the fulfillment, getting product to customer. So going offshore has its place, but for most companies developing their product, it's the wrong time to think about offshore. When you're developing your product, and you can pick some manufacturers to work with, if you can find a couple that have the skill sets that you require for your product, you can have quick response and good support, but also you can learn a ton about what has to be done to make a successful product. So if you deal with a plastic house, and there are 5 plastic houses in Kitchener-Waterloo, which I found surprising when I found that out. So there are resources right in town here where you can get pretty much anything done in injection molding. And to be able to go and talk to a supplier's engineering group that have been doing it their entire career, and ask them about the best way to approach putting your design together and how will it work with their equipment. They can give the kind of advice where you can develop a more effective, cheaper, faster product in a very short amount of time. The same goes for electronics production. There are a staggering number of electronic CMs in the Greater Toronto area. There's something like 60 of them. And that's everything from a mom and pop shop to Celestica, but there is something for almost any volume in Toronto. And again, these people do it day in and day out. So you can take your concept to them and ask them face to face what they need to do to make your product, make it well, make it at a really reasonable price. And you can learn, and you can also get quick responses. So lowering your time to market is always one of the ultimate considerations. So working locally just makes sense in almost every factor.
The interesting thing about the CMs too that you mentioned is in Markham, well, in the Greater Toronto area, is a lot of those CMs will have, multiple locations. So the caveat to everything we've just said is that there are some dependencies and all that to what the kind of product is that you're developing and what volumes. I'd say volumes are more so than anything. So if you're going to produce smartphones and you're producing millions of them, well, China might be the place for that. If you're going to produce a product that has volumes in the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, if it's a product that is highly complex, and what I mean by that is not necessarily the technology in it, but it has like a lot of moving parts, a lot of components to it, you might not want to go that route. If you have anything with a circuit board in it though, and you go to a CM in Toronto, and you know, from a scaling perspective, you start off with low volumes and they're able to handle it. If you have a CM that has offshore partners and you're really successful, the product gets there, it's a fairly easy transition. Usually by that point in time, the product isn't a prototype anymore. It's been produced for a while. Some of the bugs in production have been worked out. It's a better, cleaner package to be able to have made in those kinds of volumes. But I think a big mistake that people will make is they just automatically assume, well, I have this idea, I want to produce it. Well, I guess I have to go offshore to do it. I don't really want to do that. I don't want to move to China. I've heard all sorts of things. And I think the encouragement there should be, well, you don't necessarily have to. Very often you don't have to. And what will really dictate your need to do that will actually be the type of product that you're making and the volumes that you're making. Canada is really good on a global stage for producing low volume, high value products. And so high value, I think of like medtech, for example, products where the quality of the product, performance of the product, the data from the product is absolutely mission critical. Products that will be used by other businesses, not necessarily by consumers. So, smaller volumes. And we are well resourced to be leaders in that market. The funny thing is, nobody seems to realize it, and we hardly ever talk about it. So I think it's worth celebrating for sure.
Matt, just for clarification, when you say CM, are you speaking about a contract manufacturer?
Yes, I am, all day long. Contract manufacturers, we might, if it's for circuit boards, we might call them EMS, so electrical manufacturing service, electronic manufacturing service, I should say. If you're in the food industry, you're probably going to refer to it as a co-packer. It's funny, different product types seem to have different names for things, but essentially the service is the same, right? So these are firms that will produce your product. They are most commonly what I would refer to as build to print firms. So in other words, you provide them all the information, all the drawings, all the specifications, and they will just build it. And if your drawings are poor and your specifications are poor, well, then the product's going to be what you asked for. There are other ones that will actually have engineering support as well. And for a fee, they will offer some engineering. They won't engineer your product to the best it could be necessarily, but they will engineer it to be optimal within the processes that they have in their facility. So, and those can be very helpful resources, very helpful resources.
And in your opinion, when should a company look at hiring a contract manufacturer versus building in-house?
So that depends on a lot of factors. Early stage, Peter, you're going to have opinions on this too, I'm sure. Early stage, if you are designing the product and you've got to be considering fairly early on what your intention is, if you intend to build it in-house or not. You've probably got a fairly good idea about that before it's even a prototype, because that's a fairly high level business decision, and it's a big business commitment. A lot of firms will say, I don't want the hassle and the capital and the cost and the time and the resourcing to do stuff in-house. I'd rather partner with a contract manufacturer, have them do it. In many, many cases, that's a very sound decision. Where it becomes dangerous is when firms say, I'm going to partner with a contract manufacturer and they're going to take care of everything. I don't need to worry about it. That's where it can be dangerous. I mentioned earlier in the call, a lot of the product design will control the profitability of your company, right? Things like your warranty program, so that comes down, speaks to quality of the product, servicing of the product, logistics, shipping around different products. If there's an issue, does your product have to get returned to you? Is there reverse logistics? Your supply chain costs, all these things are basically all the line items you think about from an accounting perspective that make your company profitable or not. And if you just kind of turn them over to somebody else and leave it in their hands to say, go figure it out, you're leaving them a huge chunk of your company. So one thing that we always say and we stress is that if you're going to use a contract manufacturer, maybe especially if you're going to use a contract manufacturer, you still need to understand all the design aspects of your product, and you need to own those design aspects. So if a contract manufacturer wants to do design work for you, that's great. You make sure that you own those designs. You make sure that you have all that data. You make sure that if for any reason, maybe the relationship goes sour, or perhaps you're just wildly successful and you have to find another manufacturer to keep up with demand, let's hope that's the case, you need to have the ability to have all that data on hand in your firm in order to audit it, in order to look at your processes, in order to look at your costs, in order to make the business decisions to understand, how you might do better. If you have a bunch of firms that are making more or less the same product, and we see that in consumer goods a lot, the ones that will be more successful will always be the ones that develop a competitive advantage by being able to provide the same value everybody else is, or better, at less cost. And that doesn't mean that you go around and try to buy everything with the cheapest unit cost that you can. What I mean by that is actually they've done a lot of work to make their overall product design right from the beginning effective and efficient to be able to support ease of manufacturing. And there's a lot of things, common products, common availabilities, all that sort of stuff.
From the engineering point of view, what I do when I'm starting into a design is I'll have a concept, or even better, if the industrial engineers had a good look at it and given a concept of what the product should look and feel like. I'll have a concept of what the design should be like, and at that point, I go and talk to fabricators and contract manufacturers, and I find out. And I have some favorites, a handful of favorites I'd like to go to, but they all have strengths and weaknesses. So I like to go to them at the beginning of a design and find out what they can do in terms of providing my parts. So in sheet metal, if I've got a big sheet metal enclosure, I want to make sure that I can get them, they can get the materials and they can handle it. I want to know what their design parameters are. So I'm not asking them to do something that's outside of their normal processes. If I can design within their normal processes, I will get a cheaper, higher quality part every time. So, so the basic answer for contract manufacturing and fabrication, talk to them as early as possible. The worst you'll get out of it is some good information.
Peter, we have a comment here on chat. Claire is asking if you'd be okay with sharing your favorites list.
It's so wide. I would be totally glad to give recommendations. It kind of depends on what you're doing and what size and what volume. When we talk about sheet metal, for example, there are some. I can think of about 6 or 7 shops in the greater Waterloo area that handle small volumes, large volumes. So it kind of depends what you're doing, and I'd be totally happy to pass on some recommendations and some contact information. So just contact me afterwards, and be glad to do that.
In Waterloo region in particular, we are embarrassed. I think it's embarrassing by how much resources we have available compared to other communities, right? Like, we have industrial design houses in town, and some good ones. We have metal fabricators, we have machine shops, we have, in town here, we have contract manufacturers that do circuit boards and printed circuit board assemblies, I should say. For getting an idea together quickly, there are firms that can help with conceptual stuff, like 3D printing, for example, and you just want to build one of something and understand it from a concept perspective. And we have all of this easily within a 100-kilometer radius. I'm not sure people understand that we actually have that here in this region. It's unique what we have here, and we seldom talk about it, but you could conceivably develop just about any kind of physical product you could imagine, either right here or within a radius of this area, quite effectively. And if anyone says, yeah, well, tell me who, then tell us what you're looking for, and we'll
happy to direct you.
We'll name names. But there's just a lot here, right? And I think it's just worth saying that, because a lot of people, like I said, the hardware is hard comment. A lot of people will see that as a barrier of entry right off the bat. If you have people that are young entrepreneurs, for example, and they want to develop something, they might be thinking about a physical product or a physical device or an invention, and they might run away from it entirely because they say, well, I can't do that here. Nobody produces stuff anymore. Well, it's actually not true, and you can, and I would want people to be encouraged to look at it that way.
That's great. We have a couple of other topics we can run through today. I'm curious, for those on the line, if there are any other questions that you were hoping to get out of today's session before we move on to a few that we have we've created on our side. So if there are other things you were hoping to walk away with today, please feel free to put them into the chat and we'll get those answered. One question that did come in ahead of today's session was, what is some advice to someone who's looking to bring a novel concept into the market where people aren't expecting such a product, or the customer base isn't already well defined? How would you tackle that as a new company looking to bring a product to market?
It's a hard one for an engineer to get into because it's so sales and marketing driven. But from a design point of view, you're going to be looking at small volumes and fast turnarounds. They're I'm not sure there's any real huge differences between doing that well from an engineering point of view for a novel and small volume as there is for a large volume. You still need to go through the same investigations on how to make it and in what volumes and which suppliers are the correct ones to work with. So the process is still the same. The volumes are probably, from an engineering point of view, the only things that are going to probably change initially.
Yeah, I'll offer as well. So I spent some time at Arion Labs, which had since been acquired by FLIR Systems. When that firm started, Arion started in 2007, and they had an idea that creating a quad rotor with a camera on it could be really useful for commercial purposes, for law enforcement, for military. And that at that time, everyone says, well, yeah, now, today, but at that time, people weren't really thinking about that. It wasn't a common use case. And there had been no market established that would actually say, yeah, we would buy that product. So, that was a very interesting experience being there very early on, because I would say research is everything. If you think that you have a novel idea and it's going to change things, you need to prove that out somehow. You need to find a sample group of people that might be users of it. You need to introduce them to the concept. So you're going to have a proof of concept, and you need to get their feedback. Feedback. The customer is the most important thing in an episode, in a situation like that, to get their feedback. What do they say they need? What are they willing to pay for? And to some degree, how are you going to interpret their needs? If it's a novel product, there is going to be a lot of interpretation. It's risky. So Henry Ford, everyone knows who Henry Ford is. He didn't invent the automobile, but he made it commonly available. He made it commonly available at a time when, if you asked anybody, what they really wanted was faster horses. You didn't give them a faster horse. He said, no, you don't need a horse, you need a car. But that was because he was able to extrapolate why they really wanted faster horses, for what reasons, for what utility, and apply that to his product that served the same utility. So, it's less about, in this case, I think for the question, you have to do that initial research first, build your business case on that. And once you have that data and you have the business case, now you can start building a product specification. That product specification is really going to drive out what your supply chain needs are going to be and what your design needs are going to be. But it's really going to start with that research.
Yeah, my first startup experience was with something kind of unique as well. The company is now quite changed, but the company was called Pharma Trust, and we developed a network of kiosks to dispense prescription drugs. A very novel thing. We had a bunch of things to do, including changing provincial regulations to allow the dispensing the drugs not out of a physical pharmacy. So we had to develop not only the product, but the infrastructure around it. Like Matt said, though, it was almost exactly the same. We found some early adopters. In our case, it was hospitals, Sunnybrook particularly, but it was a group that would try the product initially and give constructive feedback. If you can find early adopters for any product, that can be golden for the input to what the consumer will actually wants. We, especially engineers, we fall into the trap often of designing what we think is cool. And I know I've gone down the rabbit hole more than once. And actually, I'm doing that for a current customer right now, and I have to correct some stuff because I did what I thought was cool. And you'd think by my age I would have learned that lesson by now. But you have to find out what the customer wants and design your product around that. So that's specifying your product around that, and finding those early adopters can be a huge leg up. It can really shorten the whole process.
We do have one question from Bob. He's asking if you're aware of any startup or scale-ups exploring AI initiatives in the supply chain management or optimization here in Waterloo or the Toronto corridor.
Yeah, there's a few. I don't know if I probably can't name names and talk about what they're doing, because that probably would violate some confidentiality, but I can say, yes, there are some. And there are some right in the region that are working on that. It's a massive topic. Basically, I mean, I think the whole premise to that is we're living in a world where data can travel faster and faster and faster. So the idea is, how do you develop systems that are going to get you the right data that you need, verified and accurate, that you can act on quickly, and can you get a competitive advantage from that? So yes, there's firms out there. There's lots of firms working on it. It's not so much the area that I find it fascinating. It's not so much the area I get into myself. We tend to help people, guide people through the process ahead of time of, if you think you're going to invest in some technology to help you do that, how do you figure out ahead of time what you might actually need? You know, how do you figure out ahead of time what your productivity challenges might be in order to make that kind of determination? So yes, there's firms out there, a lot of interesting ones, but we tend to get involved on the different end of that.
I'm curious, what are the various considerations or functions involved in getting a product ready to manufacture?
Well, I'll start with some of those. Peter will flush them out, I'm sure. Functions. So supply chain. I say supply chain, and most people will think of supply chain as someone in a back office somewhere making purchase orders. You really need to have skill sets, and I'll say these are recognized, legitimate skill sets. You need someone that can understand sourcing. Global sourcing would be a good thing, because even though you can do stuff locally, you still need to know what's available anywhere and at what cost. You need to have someone that can understand purchasing directly, purchasing strategy, contract management. That stuff's very important. Relationship management, building relationships with your vendors. Hard to build a relationship if you're brand new and you're trying to buy products and your suppliers want to sell you 10,000 and you're like, yeah, but I need one. You can't promise them volume, so how do you get them to play ball? Well, there's a trick to that. Good purchasing people can help with that. Good sourcing people can help with that. Logistics is an ever more important skill set these days, especially now. We do more stuff with logistics than I think we ever have done before, with online, e-commerce being what it is, especially now in the COVID world. Finding good people that understand how to move goods around and how to get those goods through customs effectively, cost effectively, and time effectively is gold. And if you're starting off a new product, you do well to start off with a conversation with someone that understands that early on, because there are a lot of regulations around moving goods across borders in particular. Some of them are safety related, some of them are tax and tariff related, and all this can have an impact on your business. Those are the big ones. If you plan on doing your own production in-house, you need to have people that understand materials management, so inventory management and control, people that understand how to manage production, right? Which, sounds like an easy thing, but it's actually quite complex because you have to manage people and resources and materials and time, and there's a quality control component to it, and all of these things have to factor together. So that's a lot. Very often, very early stage firms, they don't have the resources to hire all those people at once. But in those cases, I strongly recommend getting good advisors in those areas. Even if you have people that you can just bounce ideas off from time to time. Look, I'm thinking about these things. Tell me what I should consider. That still has huge value as opposed to just trying to wing it, Early in my career, I'll say I thought I was a pretty smart guy, and I figured, yeah, I'll figure it out. And I got older or smarter or both, and realized no, there's a lot of value in soliciting the opinions of others that have different skill sets, for sure.
Yeah, the sourcing is one that engineers don't do well, and there are people out there that do it extremely well, and it's finding the right product to fit your specification. We tend to, especially when I started my career, there was no internet, so it dates me. But now to search and Google your part and find umpteen possibilities doesn't mean you're actually sourcing the part properly, and you might not be finding the best version of what you want at the best price, and that the right kind of deliveries and the right volumes. Somebody that can actually source your part to your specifications is golden during design. And well, like I say, engineers are usually pretty bad at it. So that's a critical one at the beginning for design.
We have a couple of questions coming in on the chat. So the first one is, any recommendations on how to find funding to support product development? So, it can be expensive due to trial and error when you're first getting going. Or is there any funding available? Is the first part of that question.
Funding's a hard one, and I know we always struggled with it at Velocity. If any place is good at giving advice for finding early funding, it's the Velocity program, or Laurier's version.
Launchpad.
Thank you. I was just drawing a blank. I know them so well, and words are hard. Hardware's easy. Words are hard. And there's the Accelerator Center has, there are resources in town that deal well with entrepreneurs and are a rallying point for the investment, both from angel investors and small VCs. I would start there. It's a complicated network of opportunities. Like the government programs are forever ever changing, and of course, sorry, I forgot Communitech in that list.
Okay, I was actually going to add that your startup advisor at Communitech is also a good place to start, because we can also connect you with, we have Amanda Green on our team who does government grant concierge, so she can speak to all of the different grant programs available through the government. And then of course, they can also walk you through, early stage investment and what that looks like. But obviously the other ones that you mentioned, Peter, are great resources as well.
And that's actually an important point, because Communitech, I was going to say it if Peter didn't, Communitech is of course a resource. But Christina, to what you said, there are people, and some of them are at Communitech as well, they are skilled at understanding all the resources that are available. Why is that important? Because number one, filling out forms for applications for government funding is a bit of a skill in its own to get it, to have successful funding awarded. And there are people out there who are talented and skilled at doing it. The second thing is, if you can link up with somebody that has a really good idea of all the programs that are out there, and you can help them to understand what it is specifically that you're trying to do. They're better able to guide or suggest you specific to your project. And so those resources are totally invaluable. You know, there are specific programs out there for very specific things, but that it very much depends on what it is you're trying to do.
The second part to that question is, when is it best to start quality management? And they have a very specific, so such as ISO 13485, which I don't know what that means, but I hope you do. So they're asking, is it best to start that before or after prototyping?
Okay, 1345 is all about medical devices, and it includes not just the manufacturing, but the design as well. So to actually have a 1345 certified device, your engineering has to have followed that process as well. Some companies fall into the trap of having to go backwards in time and document everything posthumously, not the right word, but you know, after the fact. And so for that kind of quality control program, now is probably already now is probably almost too late. So start it as soon as possible. There are some structures around how you consider developing your product spec and doing your engineering and capturing change management and marching the documentation all the way through the process. So start it now. But that goes for not just the ISO programs. Quality control as a whole is often left until the end, and change management is a huge one. You make a change, but don't document it. It doesn't get documented in the drawings or the design. It doesn't get documented in the specification, and then 3 or 4 weeks down the road, people forget why you did that or if you did that, and the same mistakes end up getting made again and again. So quality control programs should start immediately.
Yeah, I always say right after you've had the idea and you decided to get supply chain involved, and then you started drawing on the napkin, you should be thinking about quality at that same time as well. Yeah. That's from a very general thing. So ISO 1345 is very specific depending on the nature of your product. From a regulatory perspective, it may be a requirement that you have to have it. Other specification or other quality standards like ISO 9000 series might be dictated to you by a customer. Customer might say, I'm interested in your product or your device, your service, but if you're going to be our supplier, you have to follow this quality program. So that's another consideration as well.
The same thing goes to safety certifications, UL, CSA, FCC. That is usually customer driven in the fact that you don't want to, some people won't buy unless it's been certified, but it's also a huge risk mitigation step for the company, because it tells everybody that you've put your best foot forward to prove that your product is safe for use. And if you don't do that, maybe somebody doesn't ever have a problem. And in the best of worlds, nobody gets hurt, nobody has an issue. But if somebody does, and you haven't gone through this, then that can be a life-changing event for your company. And so getting your safety certifications has some homework to do too, in terms of understanding exactly what all your components are and how they were made and what materials are in them. And that documentation usually starts with the start of design. So as you're starting to pick your parts and your processes, if you can actually document everything at that point in time in preparation for getting the safety certifications done, then you will save a ton of time and money when the time comes to actually take it to a testing lab. So start it now.
Thanks for that, Peter. There is another question here that I'm going to go back to in the chat. So this one is touching on a point that we made earlier in the call. So speaking about organizations just starting out, how would you go about sourcing product at a low MoQ? I said that properly.
Totally understand that. So I had this exact experience. The first startup that I worked for, it was that exact thing. And engineering would come to me. Engineering was basically two people would come to me and say, this is an electronic product, and say, look, we need this processor, and we need to get it in because we need to see if we can use it. And you know, how many are you going to need? Well, I think at most we'd ever need is 100. So of course you go and you want to go source that, and electronic stuff, people like to go to DigiKey, which I understand doing it from a prototype perspective, but by the way, there's cheaper alternatives to DigiKey in volume, just saying. They will go in and say, well, I need to get, 10 of these things. And you call up Avnet or Arrow or somebody, and they say, well, yeah, these are pretty important processors. They're $50 a piece. I can only sell you 1,000. So you're a young company, you're just starting up, and you go back and say, yeah, I'm going to have to spend $50,000 if I want to get you 10 of these things. Not going to fly. So two things that you do. Number one, always ask for samples, right? Whatever the product is, if it's very low volume, if you can find a supplier that's willing to play ball, very often they will provide samples because they want you to experience the product. So look for samples. Number two, if you are in a purchasing role or a sourcing role, put on your salesperson's hat, because you're never going to win this supplier over by volume promises. You want to tell them the story of your firm. You want them to be excited about your firm. You want them to feel like they would be insane if they didn't somehow get involved and support your firm, because when you go up the ladder and your firm grows and you become a really big deal, they want to ride that elevator up with you. That might sound corny or cliched, but it's actually, as long as the story's true, as long as you're not making stuff up, it actually works. And that's something that I've done time and time again. A lot of it's just trying to understand what your supplier ultimately needs out of the relationship, and giving them the confidence that they will get what they need as long as you can get what you need as well. And so much of that is just relationship and dialogue.
Perfect. So we're just about at the top of the hour here. I just one last call out to the audience. If you have any final questions for either Matt or Peter, please put them into the chat now. And then while we're waiting to see if anything comes in, Peter or Matt, any final thoughts that you want to leave with the group?
Matt?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've said it a few times through the conversation. I really want to encourage people that if they feel that they either have an idea for a product or they are in the process of producing a product and they might feel overwhelmed, don't. A lot of people try to take on too much on themselves. Do reach out, reach out to us, of course, but reach out to other people as well. There's so many people within a region, individuals and firms alike, that do have knowledge. Tap into that knowledge, use that knowledge. It's not as hard as people think, but it is a different mindset. But these things are possible. They can be made to work.
Talk to everybody. Engineers are bad at keeping their head down and wanting to do everything. I'm no different. But go out and talk to the manufacturers. Ask them what they do, how they do it, how it affects your product. They'll be glad to tell you. And just ask for advice all the way along in terms of what it means to your product. So yeah, just keep talking.
Great. Well, I didn't see any other questions come in from the chat other than a lot of thank yous. And so I'll echo that. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today, for spending an hour with us and educating us on this piece. To those who have joined the call, please feel free to connect with Peter or Matt on LinkedIn or through Berlin Kraftworks, and they can definitely help along the way as you look to bring your product to market. So thanks everyone for joining. Stay safe, stay healthy, and all the best. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.